Hello, everyone. Hello, welcome. Welcome to the Investing in Community Summit Series finale, hosted by the South Carolina Community Loan Fund. I'm Kelly Sharkey, the program manager and host for this event. Over the past 8 months, we have hosted monthly panel discussions with experts from around South Carolina that work in community development within the South Carolina Community Loan Fund's mission areas. We have welcomed over 700 folks from around the country to tune in for these engaging discussions. This afternoon, we will culminate our series with a special keynote address and discussion from author and UCI law professor Mehrsa Baradaran. Baradaran writes about banking law, financial inclusion, inequity, the racial wealth gap. Her scholarships include the books How the Other Half Banks and The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap, both published by Harvard University Press. The Color of Money, Black Banks, and the Racial Wealth Gap has received multiple awards, including the 2019 Best Book Award by the Urban Affairs Association. Her books have received significant media coverage and have been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Slate, American Banker, The Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times, as well as NPR Marketplace, C-SPAN's Washington Journal, and PBS's NewsHour. She has advised U.S. senators and congressmen on policy, testified before U.S. Congress, and spoke at forums like the U.S. Treasury and the World Bank. We're honored to have her join us for this hour this afternoon. Before we begin, we would love this session to be interactive, so please, if you have any questions, submit them through the GoToWebinar questions feature on the control panel. Following Ms. Baradaran's keynote, we will take time to answer some of your questions. We have over 300 people registered for today, so we have a lot to cover in an hour. So without further delay, I would like to welcome Mehrsa Baradaran.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So we're gonna try to do the PowerPoint in a coordinated way. So if you could start with the first slide. I want to give an overview of the book and some of the themes within. And so the book is called It's a Color of Money, and it's really about, if you can start with, go to the slide, thanks. It's about the racial wealth gap and the increasing role of credit policies, economic theories, and banks in creating and perpetuating it, and to explore sort of why it hasn't abated over time. So the wealth gap in 1865, the Black communities had about 0.5 share of the nation's wealth, and today that's barely budged to about 1.5%. So to say that our public policy efforts to eradicate the racial wealth gap have been a total failure is an understatement. And in the book, I make the case that it's the myths that we tell about markets that present some of the biggest obstacles to closing the racial wealth gap and achieving economic justice. For example, the promise of free market capitalism is that it does not discriminate. Free markets are to offer equal opportunity for all, to trade and prosper based on one's skill and ability to produce. Yet history reveals that, in fact, markets do discriminate, or alternatively, that the American economy has never borne any resemblance to a free market. For most of our history, Black men and women have been excluded from occupations, schools, neighborhoods, and trades, and the property was not protected by the law. And in each historical moment when wealth was being created, whether it was through, and this is middle class wealth for the majority of the population, whether it was through the Homestead Act, through FHA mortgage credit, through GI Bills, Black communities were shut out of land and wealth accumulation. And at certain pivot points in history, and I'll talk about Reconstruction and the Civil Rights era briefly in the presentation, and it's outlined in the book. So specifically during those moments where Black communities were demanding state intervention and capital to remedy past injustice, the rhetoric of free market capitalism has been used as a weapon to undercut those claims. Instead of real reforms, the Black community was offered a self-help market of segregated banks and businesses. In other words, leaders upholding the dominance of market institutions promised that the market would fix the problems that had been created by law and backed by private violence. So in the quick history that follows, I want to demonstrate the following. Can you move this? That insofar as the levers of power were held by white men and the economy was based on racial subordination, that markets would perpetually block Black capital accumulation. So during Reconstruction, the Confederacy, the currency of the Confederacy was literally slavery. And this is not to say that just slave labor. We talk about slave labor as, you know, the cotton exports and the tobacco exports that it produced created wealth for, you know, slaveholders and the broader economy that relied on cotton exports. But it was also that the enslaved holdings were capital as well, capital that was used as leverage for other loans, just as today one might use, you know, an asset to further get loans. And so during Reconstruction, the freedmen were expected to make the transition from being capital themselves, being the basis of currency, being the basis of wealth, to becoming capitalists. And freedmen and their abolitionist allies demanded land as a form of reparations and as a punishment for treasonous Confederates. Without land, they argued, and rightly, that freedom and justice would be meaningless and participation in capitalism would be a farce. President Andrew Johnson vetoed the land grant and the Freedmen's Bill that would have given land, the 40 acres and a mule. Except for one provision, which I'll get to in a second. And he reasoned that freedmen would be protected by the free market and by contract law, that they would just bargain for fair wages and buy their own land. And this, at the time, was either unbelievably naive or incredibly cynical. The Southern economy was nothing like a free market. Whites refused to sell property to Black men and women. Southern legislators, lawyers, and judges drafted laws governing every aspect of Black labor. They restricted Black men and women from skilled trades. Vagrancy laws were prevalent, and wages were capped by law and by cabal between employers. And violations of those laws led to convict labor without due process. So by the end of Reconstruction, most freedmen were left landless, voteless, and with practically every profession blocked to them. Their only choice was to grow cotton. And of course, that was the point. The worldwide cotton market was heavily dependent on cheap and abundant cotton from the United States. And in order to have enough cotton exports, the freedmen had to grow it. And for this to happen, they could not be landowners. America could not go the way of Haiti, where there, after independence, the former slaves refused to grow sugar and output halted. They grew crops they could eat instead. So if you have land, you're going to grow half for, 2/3 of it to grow for feeding your family, and the other, third or half for debt or sugar or cash crop. And that is the basics of agricultural economy if you own the land. If you don't own the land, then you're stuck growing this debt crop. But that ensures a low cotton price that then the merchants in the north and Liverpool and across in the UK could ensure that the prices of cotton would stay low. It was a commodity price that drove the decision not to give land. It was not that the government was constrained by capitalism or laissez-faire economic. The federal government at the time was actively providing free land to private railroads for expansion and to white men through the Homestead Acts to settle the West. Black men and women were denied land because, as Andrew Johnson explained, America was and should remain a white man's government. And that government had control over capital and land, and it wanted cotton production. That was the basis of the Southern economy. And because it had control of lawmaking, it enforced the state's monopoly through violence and through land withholding. So instead of getting land, the freed men and women did get a bank in 1865. And Union General Oliver Otis Howard explained that the bank was better anyway because it would teach about thrift and savings, and that freedmen should earn land and not receive it as a gift. The Freedmen's Savings Bank was the only tangible creation of the Reconstruction era Freedmen's Bureau. No bank before or ever since has resembled the Freedmen's Bank. It was created by Congress, it was signed into law by Lincoln with a special charter. The Federal Reserve was still decades away. And the bank was immediately successful. It was embraced by the freed slaves. And one of the main reasons that the bank was trusted was because their money that it issued seems to be backed by the federal government. The bills and the notes of the building were covered in government insignia. These notes seemed to be backed by the government, and bank managers plastered their notes and buildings with pictures of Grant and Sherman and Lincoln. And this was valuable at the time. At the time, there wasn't, we did not have a national currency. We were about to get one, but most bank bills and notes were valued based on the perceived safety and soundness of that bank. So if JP Morgan issued you a $100 note, you would think it was a $100 note because JP Morgan was, the richest guy, and his bank was likely to be solid. But if you got a $100 note from a, South Carolina bank that you'd never heard of, using any state here, you would discount that note because it may not be redeemable. We did not have FDIC insurance. We did not have a Federal Reserve. And so the message that the Freedmen's Bank was portraying across the South and across the United States was that the notes of this bank were backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. Treasury. And the mission of the bank, per congressional charter, was to safeguard the deposits of the freed slaves. It was not going to issue loans. It wasn't a commercial bank. It was basically to be a glorified piggy bank, but a valuable one because of this perceived backing by the U.S. Treasury. And for decades, the bank disseminated propaganda throughout the South advertising these accounts. And the bank capital grew to what today would amount to about $1.5 billion of capital, too much money for the white manager to resist. The bank president was Henry Cook, who was a brother of infamous Wall Street speculator Jay Cook, and he took the deposits, essentially looted the bank to speculate, to make personal profits. And it turns out that the bank was not backed by the full faith and credit of the Treasury, and depositors lost half of their deposits during the bank failure. No one went to prison. It was Henry Cook blamed the losses on just the market. And the significance of the failure reverberated and lingered in the community in very interesting ways. Black leaders and Black bankers for almost a century repeated the assertion that the bank had caused the Black community to not only distrust white banks, but also their own banks. I began this project as I was starting to review the FDIC data on the unbanked and underbanked, and was struck by the staggering race differentials, especially in the South, where 60% of Black men and women in the South were unbanked or underbanked. And many Black men and women said that their main reason was distrust of banks. And I've asked this question to audiences, who were, whether anyone remembers a grandmother, grandfather saying, don't put your money in a bank, put it under a mattress, it's not safe. And so this failure really reverberated in very damaging ways. So W.E. Du Bois said that not even 10 additional years of slavery could have done so much to throttle the thrift of the freedmen as the mismanagement and bankruptcy of the Freedmen's Bank chartered by the nation for their special aid. So by the time the Freedmen's Bank failed, the disenfranchisement of the Black population was complete. The rights written into the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were nullified by legislators, courts, police powers, and the paramilitary violence of the Klan. In a series of decisions as the Supreme Court made between 1873 and 1898, essentially weakened the rights that Black citizens in the South had under those amendments, blessed Jim Crow disenfranchisement, outlawed the Civil Rights Act of 1865. And the Chief Justice wrote, this is 20 years after emancipation, that since slavery was over, it was high time for the slaves to stand on for the freedmen to stand on their own 2 feet and stop being treated as the special favorite of the law. So already this charge of reverse discrimination was being issued. In the next century, the 14th Amendment came up more, still does, to defend corporations against the state overreach than it did Black men and women against the hostile arm of the state. The state uses its power to uphold property rights and corporations rather than the rights of Black men, perhaps because that was their special favorite. After the Freedmen's Bank, Black banks formed in response to Jim Crow in the South. There were several Black banks that were born out of necessity. These banks were oriented towards self-help and community building. They were linked with a church, a secret society, an insurance fund, a fraternal society, and they basically did it all in the Jim Crow South. So one of these banks was Maggie Walker's St. Luke's Penny Bank. She was the first woman of any race to start a bank. I know it's International Women's Month. We're a little bit out of Black History Month, so this is, a moment to consider, the heroic efforts from the Black women and men during this time to really operate successful banks. So she was the first Black banker inducted into the Virginia Bankers Association. She was the first woman of any race to start a bank, and her bank is one of the handful that survives the Great Depression. She saved several other Black banks by merging them into hers, by offering them liquidity. Her bank actually survives, not herself, her bank survived until the 2008 financial crisis, in which it was wiped out. So by 1910, a lot of these banks are running, and the Great Migration is starting to happen as Black men and women are leaving the South into concentrated populations in the North, which of course leads to a demand for Black banks and also heavy segregation. This is the heyday of Black banking. There's about 130 Black banks formed during this time. Segregation was almost complete, and there were several commercial banks during this time. But as I say in the book, I won't go into it much here. Even during this time, if there was a time for a segregated economy to work, this would have been it. But for a variety of economic reasons and for the ways that the banks work, it could not work. The deposits for these banks were small and volatile. It led to high operating costs, lowered their ability to lend, and their assets, and this is something that plagues Black communities to today, and especially Black banks, the assets that the banks lent to was on homes, mortgages, which most banks do. And the way that home prices were during that time, and unfortunately, it is still the case that home prices in Black communities, segregated Black communities, don't increase in value. Especially during that era, when a neighborhood tipped into a Black neighborhood, so this was between 5 to 10% during that time of the Great Migration, few Black families would move in, they would pay a premium on a home, and then the neighborhood would tip and the home values would all decline in value. So any assets that the banks held were immediately underwater. So this was a state that Black banks were stuck in. And then of course, the New Deal completely changes Black, all banking, but especially took the risk out of banking in general and really enforced segregation. So this is one example. Jesse Binga's bank is a tragic but also interesting story of one Black banker's ability and challenges of trying to lend in Chicago during that time. I think it's a fascinating but also really tragic story. So going into the New Deal, and the New Deal, Roosevelt restructured the U.S. and banking credit markets through heavy state intervention. Can you change the slide? Thank you. Between 1933 and 1970, hundreds of thousands of small community banks, credit unions, and thrifts were formed. They're safe, stable, and they're profitable. And the reasons these banks are thriving is because the New Deal essentially takes the risk out of banking. Deposits are insured by the FDIC, loans are subsidized by the FHA, the GI Bill, the farm loan programs, and Fannie Mae creates a secondary market for these loans. All of these built the middle class. That is, one of the led to the best, of most robust and profitable era in American banking and American life. It created intergenerational wealth through home ownership, low cost higher education. And the New Deal also built the white suburb of homeowners and the segregated Black ghetto through redlining. And I use the word ghetto because of the connotation that it was used at the time. It was a forced segregation. That's what Black activists called it at the time. And I think that really shows the structures at play that created these dynamics. So if you can this is one typical redlined map, and you can actually look and see every neighborhood is now available, these redline maps. There's a website called Mapping Inequality, and you could drill down and find the maps of every neighborhood. So the HLC appraisers did, using census data and elaborate questionnaires, was to predict the likelihood of property appreciation in neighborhoods across the country. And these maps had 4 color-coded categories based on perceived risks. So A, green, blue, B, blue, C, yellow, and D, red, green being the most desirable and red being the least. And in making judgments about a home's potential to appreciate, HOLC mapmakers, like the individual appraisers before them, used race as the #1 indicator of risk and desirability. So green neighborhoods were homogeneous and white, and at the other scale, the red neighborhoods were predominantly Black or racially inharmonious. And FHA bureaucrats advised developers to include racial covenants on all their homes, and for realtors to not show homes to Black men and women. So I'll show you one example of a actual analysis for this neighborhood. So this is Atlanta, Georgia, and I use this because that neighborhood is where Spelman and Morehouse College and Atlanta University are, and was one of the wealthiest neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods in the country, and certainly in the state of Georgia. And they were otherwise the most desirable home structure. So they were single family owned homes, which was the highest rating you could get under these this risk category. And if you look at the map, the way that they looked at it, it says Negro schools, parks, universities, community businesses, churches. So it's a desirable area for Black individuals. And then if you look at the inhabitants, it says Negro business and professional men, clerical workers, foreign-born families, and infiltration of. Okay, so how close are other races from these areas? And of course, this community is redlined. Even though it was wealthy, even though it had desirable homes, because it was Black, it was redlined. And so race was the #1 indicator used to determine who would be eligible for an FHA guaranteed loan. And if you were not eligible for an FHA guaranteed loan, it essentially meant you did not get a loan at all. So as I look at the data on Black banks and white banks during this time, hundreds of thousands of white lending banks, community banks, credit unions, thrifts are formed. And during that time, only 5 Black banks between 1934 and 1968 are formed. There isn't a lot of capital to lend into these communities. And so they get stuck in this perpetual state of capital growth on one side, because the suburbs are allowing for people to build wealth and then get leverage on that wealth, go to school through the GI Bill, have a place for their kids to go have parks and schools that are funded by property taxes. And in the Black areas and in inner cities, businesses are moving out. Infrastructure is increasingly, bifurcating Black communities, and there aren't homeowners. And so you're paying more now in rent than people are paying in a mortgage, and you're not building equity in your home. The schools are deteriorating. Of course, there's all of the incidental, policing and all of that stuff that had come with it. So as the white American economy grew by leaps and bounds, a segregated Black economy became locked in a state of perpetual depression, using the typical factors for depression. So when Martin Luther King says, I started the book with this quote, says when there's a 11% unemployment in the white community, we call that a depression, a big recession. But if you look at that in the Black community, it's been a perpetual state of depression, and it's these factors. So in the next couple slides, I show the ways that white communities, you can keep going, white communities at first, there's signs and violence, and then the legal apparatus of racial covenants, and these were essentially required in every deed, every mortgage, until they were not enforceable in 1970. But essentially, it says no property shall be sold, rented to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. The next one is a typical racial covenant in a contract. if you look up, your home, these are two different ones, to respectable white people, Caucasian race. If you look up your deed, I, had a student in when I was teaching at UGA go to the government deed. I, gave her my home address and she found my deed there, and mine also had a racial covenant that said, I shall not lend to a Caucasian person. They're no longer enforceable, of course, but these were included because it was not just about, racism. It was also about home values, which essentially baked in those methods of racism. So I'm going to quickly go through the next little bit. Basically, not only was it this mortgage market that was bifurcated and created, intergenerational wealth patterns, but there was also a consumer credit market. So in the redlined Black neighborhoods, there wasn't a wealth building, there wasn't equity, and there also wasn't a consumer lending market like there was in the white suburbs. So in the white suburbs, as people are homeowning, middle-class jobs, there's also the FHA had a consumer credit line that was called a revolving credit line. So this is essentially the modern credit card. You can revolve your credit 1 month into the next. You could go to Montgomery Ward or Sears Roebuck or whatever and get something on credit, and then you would take that principal and roll it over, and the interest rates were capped from 6 to 10%. And this allowed for that post-war sort of boom in consumer spending. You bought your cars, your furniture, all of this stuff on credit, and there was a different credit market. It was the FHA allowed for that revolving credit, those balances to be sold into the secondary market, and people were able to lower the risks. In the Black neighborhoods, it was sort of night and day. It was installment credit. So installment credit is a very different credit arrangement than revolving credit. Installment credit is where you go to the store itself issues you the credit. You buy, your furniture, your refrigerator, your even, doctor bills, from an installment lender, and they bundle all of those together. So you're paying 10 to 12 times more for the goods themselves, plus, high interest that aren't capped by usury rates. And if you miss a payment, they had bundled the loans together. And so that would mean that you would, if you paid off, 90% of that whole bundle, you forgot, you didn't pay one last payment, or you just didn't have the money, the whole thing would be taken away. And this is where the seeds of the civil rights movement started to grow. So early on, Malcolm X and the Black nationalists kind of picked up on this idea of the fact that the installment lenders happen to be white, and so why should white people be running the banks in our community? So early on, a lot of this unrest started against these installment lenders. Martin Luther King's mission, at first, you can skip that because I won't do the video. Skip. Yeah. So this is the March on Washington. I won't go into it now, but in 1954, he took his case to this is 10 years before the March on Washington. He took his case to the Black population in Ebony magazine and says, essentially, we've this 5 to 10 point agenda for our civil rights, equity, playing. They didn't call it civil rights; they called it just justice. And it was top 3 were create Black banks, create Black credit unions, create union organizing to get good jobs, and 5 or 6 was voting rights and things like that had already been guaranteed in the previous amendments but had not been issued. And so I like to show this chunk of the I Have a Dream speech, because I think we focus on the content of character and the parts that are taken as a that his message was about don't judge a person by their race, but really it was a message of justice and economic justice needing to be achieved until in order to achieve sort of equality in that sense. So let me go sort of quickly beyond this. So the last thing that Martin Luther King did before he was assassinated was a radical poor people's movement. He uniting poor Black people, Appalachian whites, Mexican laborers, Puerto Rican from city, to do another march on Washington for jobs and equality. And yet, everything had changed between 1965 and 1968 when he was killed, and he was no longer being listened to like he was in 1964. The civil rights laws, the voting rights laws, Brown versus Board of Ed, Montgomery bus boycott, Selma March, all of those happened before 1965. And the national appetite for civil rights reform had shifted dramatically by 1966, to which Roger Wilkins of the NAACP quipped, "It would have been hard to pass the Emancipation Proclamation in Congress in 1966, given the atmosphere." And so by 1969, Malcolm X, Dr. King, JFK, Robert Kennedy had all been killed. Johnson was out of office, and the consensus of the Black community toward the civil rights movement, if there was one, was that it had failed or that it was incomplete. Yes, the white-only signs were gone, but joblessness, dilapidated housing, and intractable poverty were not. The segregation patterns remained intact. They never got disrupted. The Federal Reserve in 1967 found that Black communities had 1/5 the wealth of white families. Half of Black children grew up in deep poverty compared to 9% of white children. And by that point, Black protests had turned into a resistance that was more violent. So Black ghettos across the country erupted in violence. And to many, it felt like a domestic war. Go to the next one, thanks. This CBS broadcast, called the riots, he says, "This is not a riot, it was an insurrection against all authority." And there were several commissions and studies on the riots, and the Kerner Commission being one of the most, thorough, came out with said basically that white communities have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget is that white society is deeply impacted in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. And so this was taken up by several of the Senate banking committees, specifically William Proxmire, who ended up writing the CRA and other laws, really kind of trying to bring back sort of lenders into the Black neighborhoods, but without the will or the desire to really change the segregation patterns. Part of what happened is that going into that 1968 election, you had, Robert Kennedy, Hubert Humphrey, George Romney, and Nelson Rockefeller from the right, and some from the left, with, plans for, integration or reparations, something meaningful to address these long patterns of segregation. George Romney describes the white. This is George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, describes the white suburbs as a high-income white noose around the Black inner city. He said it was a federal government's job to fix it. But of course, the winning candidate was President Nixon, and who, was his top aides years later said that there was John L. Rickman admit that the subliminal appeal to the anti-Black voter was always present in Nixon's speeches, and he put together a strategy based on law and order and Black capitalism. And what Nixon meant by Black capitalism was essentially, very vague, but with appeal to everybody. He talked about, we're going to move beyond civil rights, and he was going to increase Black businesses in the Black ghetto without doing integration. So George Romney ended up being his HUD advisor, and George Romney kept pushing for integration plans, and Nixon kept stopping them. And what he did was, he issued, affirmative action quotas. He, put deposits, treasury deposits in Black banks, started sort of Black capitalism lending programs, essentially keeping intact the segregation patterns, not spending any capital, putting deposits in banks, which doesn't really help, as I explain in the book, and tax credits and affirmative action. And really, it has that, the reason why that I spent some time in the book explain that is because that's essentially the pattern that we are still following, is Nixon's Black capitalism. So if the presidents after Nixon, this is an ad that I won't go into, Ronald Reagan, talks about minority business, Black-owned business is a beneficial multiplier. He talks about a free economy, that his civil rights plank was lower taxes, tax cuts, and that was a remedy to all sort of discrimination. President Clinton really doubled down on this. If you could move forward. Yeah. He talked no longer about Black capitalism, but about community empowerment. Getting off a dependent, helpless population. His HUD president was Andrew Cuomo, who pushed for, he calls, find the Cuomo quote here. He calls it, this is not about charity, it's about profits, it's about investments, and that they were going to put together, niche community banks. This is the start of the CDFI program. If you want to go to that, Larry Summers and Cuomo and Clinton, said that the CDFI program was like a niche venture capital firms that deploy their superior knowledge of an emerging market to invest and manage risk better than other investors. These banks were market scouts that would seek out profits in overlooked markets. Never mind that Black-owned banks had long been using, trying to find profits in these markets. So instead of being called ghettos or segregated Black communities, they were now called enterprise zones, emerging markets, untapped markets, opportunity zones, which contained hidden profits that created, profit-oriented private enterprise could exploit. It would create a win-win for entrepreneurs and alleviate poverty by also providing profits. And of course, instead of capital, these neighborhoods would be sent to entrepreneurs, and eventually the entrepreneurs did end up finding profits, which were subprime loans. And the Black community lost 53% of their wealth when that subprime market blew up. Not that the CDFIs were at all responsible, that was Wall Street, but it was all due to never having really disrupted those patterns of segregation and never really addressing them at their core. So now, of course, we have, opportunity zones that are a legacy of that. And so just to end, we have to shed the destructive myth that markets will fix the problems that public policy created. We need public policy that is as strong as the New Deal public policy that created these problems to begin with. We can't deflect the responsibility of economic equality onto these communities alone. So I'll end with a W.E.B. Du Bois quote in 1948. He said that the great problem of American democracy was that it had not yet been tried. So thank you for your time. I'm open to questions.
Great, thank you so much. I'm now going to welcome Anna Lewin, our South Carolina Community Loan Fund CEO, to get some discussion questions going. And audience, please feel free to submit your questions in the question panel.
Sure, thank you so much, and thank you for the book. Truly a very important, an important book to read and to understand and to make sense of. Curious as to your thoughts and sort of moving us now. I wonder what would be different if you had written this book sort of post-COVID. Obviously, history doesn't change, but thinking about what needs to happen and sort of is there an opportunity right now to ensure an equitable recovery as we get hopefully closer to moving out of COVID and this sort of COVID phase in our history. So would love to hear any thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, one of the quotes that I keep coming back to in the book was something that, someone in 1910s or something said about Harlem. They said, when Wall Street catches a cold, Harlem gets the flu. The other variation was something like when, Wall Street gets sick, Harlem gets pneumonia or something like that. And, I think COVID being that it was a race-blind virus, right? It affected all of us, our bodies, without, regards to our neighborhood or race. And yet it still affected Black and Brown communities much more significantly, more deaths, more hardships, more job losses. And it's actually a demonstration of how these trends work. It's not, you don't need further racism to create hardships. You just have, you had this, more essential workers. You had fewer hospital beds. You had, stories of different hospitals, and even in New York City, right? How many hospitals were getting overloaded and weren't able to attend to those needs? How many people had the health care that was required to be able to, survive the plague? Who got access to, who was able to stay home in quarantine and have a job that they were able to keep, paying their rent, and who was, susceptible to eviction, and really, it really highlighted, I think, how I think that one of the myths that I tried to overcome in the book is this idea that poverty is a personal choice and responsibility, and that people just need to make better choices. And early on, you did see some of that coming up during COVID, like, well, if people were just healthier, if people just, were making bad choices. But really soon we just realized that this is not an issue of personal responsibility. There was nothing you could do to not be an essential worker and to have underlying health conditions, and also to be exposed, and not have the treatment necessary. And so I think that this hopefully busted that myth for some folks, that there are these systemic patterns, and that, when Wall Street gets a cold, Harlem will inevitably get the flu. And one of the things that I think was the most confusing to folks during this COVID crisis is that Wall Street actually didn't get a cold. Wall Street did quite well. The markets kept increasing, and capital reserves kept increasing for those who had it, and those who didn't kept losing. And I think that's going to take some time to absorb. But really, I think the lesson there was that you can shield yourself from some of these downturns with enough capital, and that people have been able to do that over time.
Right. So South Carolina Community Loan Fund, obviously a South Carolina-based community development financial institution. I know we've got some other CDFI friends on the call. Tell us a little bit about what you think is the most important thing that we can do as community-based and community development lenders to get capital into Black-owned businesses, Black communities, Black households, particularly given the history of sort of the lack of access to capital and sort of the lack of collateral that exists, some of the very reasons that you talked about.
Yeah, I think it's the hard thing is that I think that there are some things that banks can do and some things that they can't, right? I think the myth that the banks can fix this alone has to go away. CFIs are great institutions, and they're not creating harm. And community banks are barely surviving themselves, right, given some of the trends in the market. And so I just think it behooves us all to fight for policies that would help both community banks and CDFIs serve the communities that they're trying to be responsive to. So that capital is there. It just needs to be accessed and being able to be built. You can't just you can't lend to grow capital if the fundamentals aren't there, if those asset prices aren't going to rise. I think one thing that banks can be aware of is those gentrification patterns, and be sure to build equity before that equity gets stripped in some of these communities, which has been a big problem over time. So I think being aware of the trends and being aware of the things that the discrimination that is part of the algorithm, to begin with, without any input, the fact that you can have an AI created algorithm that takes out any race metrics and still comes out with an output that tracks with these historic segregation patterns, shows that this stuff is pretty, deep into the system. And so how do we, make sure that we're not at least replicating those patterns?
Right. So one question for the audience, from the audience that we have is, based on your book and all the work you've done, how do you think the COVID-19 bill that has passed is a move sort of that actually works for Black communities?
You know, I think the bills that have been passed recently have been of a different nature than some of the historical stuff. I think, you know, the fact that we're recognizing that children should have a bare floor. I mean, the child funds that were available in this last rescue package, the one that was just passed, I think are going to be game changing for certain families. I think the stimulus funds, I mean, I think some of the worries that have kept lawmakers and policymakers from issuing these robust helps in the past are no longer there. I think we really need to recognize that things like the New Deal worked because we took poverty and inequality as not a personal responsibility, as a systemic thing. The Great Depression hit everyone, and here's a program that's going to boost us all, and it's going to be a win-win. And I really do think that having that sort of mindset and not a zero-sum, you know, if someone gets money for their children, well, what about those who don't have kids? Or if we, you know, help student loans or help people with, you know, their eviction, well, what about those of us who were able to pay rent? You know, just take those things out of it and say, well, what do we want to guarantee children in America? Do we want them to have food, safe schools, no matter who their parents are? What kinds of things do we want to ensure for these kids? Then I think we can do better policy that way.
Yeah, thank you for that. It looks like we are running up against time. I know you have a 2 o'clock stop. Just wanted to give you the opportunity if there's any sort of any point you didn't touch or any sort of closing remarks before we hand it back over to Kelly, but also just want to thank you on behalf of South Carolina Community Loan Fund and all of our attendees who have been able to join us today, for you and for taking the time to come and present this information. So thank you.
Thanks so much. No, this is great. Thanks for inviting me.
Sure. And Kelly, we'll pass it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mehrsa. We really appreciate your time. So this concludes our first Investing in Community Summit series. So we want to give a big thanks to our panelists and our moderator over the last 8 months. And thank you to everyone who registered and attended. We had over 1,000 of you over the last 8 months. So thanks again. All of our sessions are posted on YouTube, and you're welcome to go back and visit them anytime. This session will be emailed out to you automatically later this afternoon. So as always, please use South Carolina Community Loan Fund as a resource for your business and community development needs. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Thanks.